It was the way she said it, like it didn't matter, like I didn't matter. That antique first edition of The Great Gatsby I'd spent months tracking down. The one I'd proudly brought home after winning it at auction, sat on the coffee table between us. Jennifer glanced at it, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile, and said, "Oh, that old thing?" in front of her colleagues. Her tone was light, dismissive, but it cut deeper than it should have. It wasn't just about the book. It was the way she looked at me after, like I was some kind of relic myself, something she'd outgrown. The room went quiet for a moment, her co-workers exchanging glances I couldn't quite read. I forced a laugh, trying to play it off, but the sting lingered. That book had been my treasure, the kind of thing I thought she'd appreciate, or at least pretend to. But lately, Jennifer's appreciation for anything I cared about seemed to have evaporated. Her attention was always elsewhere, usually on her phone or on the next work event she was rushing off to. I'd noticed the changes before, but that moment with the book crystallized it. The way she'd started dressing differently, sharper, more expensive, like she was trying to impress someone. The way she lingered at the office late, always with some excuse about a networking dinner or a team-building retreat. And the way she'd stopped asking about my day, stopped caring about the little things that used to make us us. The empty chair at the dinner table became a regular fixture. I'd sit there, reheating leftovers, staring at the cold cup of coffee I'd poured for her hours earlier. The house felt quieter now, even when she was home. She'd sit across from me, scrolling through her phone, her laughter reserved for whatever was on the screen, not for me. One night I tried to talk to her about it. "You've been distant lately," I said, my voice steady but my hands gripping the edge of the table. She looked up, her eyes narrowing like I'd accused her of something. "Distant?" she repeated, her tone sharp. "Jason, I'm just busy. You know that. You're being paranoid." Paranoid. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and accusatory. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think it was just work stress or some temporary phase. But something in her voice, that edge, that impatience, told me it was more than that. The antique book stayed on the coffee table, untouched, gathering dust. Every time I passed it, I felt that same ache, that same sense of something slipping away. I didn't know it then, but that book would become a symbol of everything I was about to lose, and everything I'd eventually fight to reclaim. For now, though, I just sat there, staring at the empty chair, wondering when exactly Jennifer had stopped seeing me as someone worth coming home to. The receipt was sitting in the junk drawer, crumpled and forgotten, like a piece of evidence someone had tried to bury. I wasn't even looking for it. I was just trying to find a damn AAA battery for the remote. But there it was, staring back at me. A receipt from the Grand Marriott dated 3 weeks ago. The same day Jennifer had told me she was at a medical conference in Chicago. The same day she'd texted me a photo of a hotel lobby, saying, "Wish you were here." I remember that text. I remember feeling a pang of guilt for not being more supportive of her career, for not being the kind of husband who could drop everything and fly out to be with her. I'd even sent her a bouquet of flowers that afternoon, a peace offering for the argument we'd had the night before. Now, standing there with that receipt in my hand, I felt like the world's biggest fool. I unfolded it carefully, as if it might disintegrate if I handled it too roughly. The total was staggering, $1, $200 for a single night. My stomach churned. Jennifer had always been frugal, the kind of person who clipped coupons and hunted for deals. She'd lectured me just last month about spending $100 on a pair of boots I didn't really need. And yet here she was, dropping over $1,000 on a hotel room. I pulled out my phone and opened the calendar app. That day was circled in red, marked with the words, "Medical Conference, Chicago." I scrolled back through the weeks, noting all the other circled dates, business trips, late nights at the office, weekend retreats. Suddenly, they all felt suspicious. I started cross-referencing them with my own memories, trying to piece together the timeline. The weekend she'd said she was visiting her sister in Denver. Had I actually spoken to her sister? Or had I just taken Jennifer's word for it? The night she'd claimed to be stuck in traffic for hours. Had I ever seen the traffic report? My hands were shaking as I dialed her number. It rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What would I even say? "Hey, honey, just found a receipt for a luxury hotel stay on a day you were supposedly out of town. Care to explain?" No, that wasn't the kind of conversation you had over the phone. This needed to be face-to-face. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions at work but barely registering anything around me. My mind kept circling back to that receipt, to the unanswered phone calls, to the growing list of absences that suddenly felt like lies. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at that damn receipt, trying to make sense of it all. The calendar was still open on my phone, the circled dates glaring at me like accusations. I started jotting down notes, connecting the dots, building a timeline that painted a picture I didn't want to see. Each new piece of information felt like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't stop. I had to know the truth no matter how much it hurt. And as I sat there, surrounded by the evidence of her betrayal, I realized something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about the hotel receipt. This was about trust, about the foundation of our marriage crumbling beneath my feet. And I had no idea how to stop it. The teacup shattered against the wall, its jagged pieces scattering across the kitchen floor like shards of our marriage. Jennifer didn't flinch. She just stood there, arms crossed, her face a mask of cold indifference. Her eyes bore into mine, unblinking, like she was daring me to say something I'd regret. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. Anger, betrayal, or maybe just the weight of years unraveling all at once. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her voice steady, almost clinical. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even remorse. It was a statement, delivered with the precision of a scalpel, slicing through whatever fragile hope I'd been clinging to. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake her until she saw me, really saw me, the man who'd spent half his life building a home with her. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, my hands trembling at my sides, and let her words sink in. They didn't just sting. They burrowed deep, like a poison spreading through my veins. When she finally admitted it, her voice didn't waver. She didn't look away. She told me about him, about the late nights at work, the texts that weren't about projects or deadlines, the hotel rooms she'd booked under fake names. She said it wasn't about me. She said she needed this, needed to feel wanted, needed to feel alive. Like I hadn't spent years trying to be enough for her. Like our life together was some kind of cage she'd been desperate to escape. I glanced at the framed wedding photo on the mantel, the one we'd taken on the beach in Maui, her hair blowing in the wind, my arm around her waist. Someone, probably her, had turned it face down. I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. The silent dinner we'd shared the night before flashed in my mind. The clink of silverware against plates. The way she'd stared at her phone instead of me. I thought she was distracted by work. Stupid. So stupid. "Do you love him?" I asked, my voice breaking on the last word. She hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. Her silence was an answer, louder than any words could have been. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to hate him. But mostly, I hated myself. For not seeing it sooner, for not being enough, for letting her walk all over me like I was some kind of doormat. The broken teacup at my feet seemed to mock me, its jagged edges a reminder of how easily something whole could be destroyed. She tried to explain, to justify it, but her words just bounced off me, hollow and meaningless. I didn't care about her reasons. I didn't care about her needs. All I could think about was the life we'd built, the years we'd wasted, and the future she'd stolen from us. When she finally stopped talking, the house felt too quiet, too empty, like the walls were closing in. I wanted to leave, to walk out and never look back, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot. I wasn't ready to let go, not yet. Not like this. But as I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, I realized something. She wasn't the same person I'd married. Maybe she never had been. And maybe, just maybe, that was the hardest truth of all. The rain came down in sheets, soaking through Jason's jacket as he walked aimlessly through the city. His feet carried him without direction, each step heavier than the last. The streets were slick with water, the neon signs of storefronts reflecting in fragmented streaks across the pavement. He didn't care where he was going. The weight in his chest was too much to bear, pressing down on him like a physical force, threatening to crack his ribs. He passed an old bookstore, its windows fogged with condensation. The faint glow of a single lamp inside caught his eye, and for a moment he paused. It reminded him of the first time he'd taken Jennifer to his favorite bookstore, back when they were still young and stupidly in love. She'd laughed at the way he geeked out over first editions, teasing him about his dusty old treasures. He'd bought her a copy of Pride and Prejudice, even though she'd admitted she'd never read it. "I'll read it with you," she'd said, her fingers brushing his as she took the book. That night, they'd stayed up late, her head resting on his shoulder as he read aloud. He could still hear her voice, soft and warm, saying, "You're such a dork, but I love it." Now the memory felt like a knife twisting in his gut. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets and kept walking. The rain blurred the city around him, turning it into a hazy, impersonal mess. He thought about the years they'd spent together, the slow, almost imperceptible way things had started to unravel. It wasn't one big fight or a single moment of betrayal that had done it. It was the little things. The way she'd stopped laughing at his jokes, the way she'd started spending more time at work, the way she'd look at him sometimes like she was trying to figure out if he was worth the effort. He'd noticed, of course he had, but he'd told himself it was just a phase. Everyone goes through rough patches, right? Except it wasn't a phase. It was the beginning of the end. He found himself standing in front of their old apartment building, the one they'd lived in before they bought the house. It looked smaller now, shabbier. The paint was peeling, and the awning sagged under the weight of the rain. He remembered the night they'd moved in, how they'd celebrated with cheap wine and takeout. They'd made promises to each other that night, promises about forever and always and never giving up. He'd believed every word. But forever didn't last as long as he'd thought it would. The rain let up slightly, and he turned away from the building, his feet carrying him toward the park. It was empty, the benches slick with rainwater, the trees dripping and heavy. He sat down on one of the benches, ignoring the dampness seeping through his jeans. His mind wandered to the box of old letters he'd found in the attic last week. He'd been looking for Christmas decorations and stumbled across them instead. They were letters they'd written to each other in the early days, back when they were still figuring out how to be together. He'd read a few of them, his heart aching at the earnestness in their words. They'd been so sure of each other back then, so certain that love would be enough to get them through anything. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos he'd taken of the letters. His fingers trembled as he zoomed in on one of Jennifer's, her handwriting looping and messy. "I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you," she'd written. "You're my everything." He put the phone away, his chest tightening. The rain started up again, harder this time, and he sat there, letting it wash over him. He thought about the last time they talked, really talked. It had been months ago, maybe longer. She'd been distant, distracted, and when he'd asked her if everything was okay, she just shrugged and said, "I'm fine." He'd believed her, or maybe he'd just wanted to. Now he wondered if he'd ever really known her at all. The sound of a car horn jolted him out of his thoughts, and he stood up, his legs stiff from sitting in the cold. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay here. The weight in his chest was still there, heavy and unrelenting, but now there was something else too. A spark of anger, hot and sharp. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. How could she do this to him? To them? After everything they'd been through, after all the promises they'd made, how could she just throw it all away? He walked faster, the rain pounding against his skin. The city around him was a blur of lights and noise, but he barely noticed. His mind was a storm of emotions. Grief, anger, regret, all swirling together in a chaotic mess. He didn't know what he was going to do, but one thing was clear. He couldn't go back to the way things were. Something had to change. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of determination. He wasn't going to let her destroy him. Not anymore. The rain tapped against the window like a Morse code message I couldn't decipher. My son, Ethan, sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands balled into fists so tight his knuckles were white. The family photo album lay open between us, a relic of happier times. Smiles frozen in glossy paper, vacations we'd taken, birthdays we'd celebrated. Felt like looking at someone else's life. "She told me," Ethan said, his voice cracking under the weight of words he'd been holding back. "Months ago, she said it was just a friendship, that it didn't mean anything." I stared at him, my chest tightening. Jennifer had always been close to Ethan, her golden boy, the one she confided in. But this was a betrayal I hadn't seen coming. My own son had known about her affair, and he'd kept it from me. The anger bubbled up hot and fast, but I forced it down. This wasn't about Ethan. This was about her. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He looked away, his jaw tightening. I didn't want to believe it, and I didn't want to hurt you. But then, I saw them, at that coffee shop downtown. She was laughing with him, Dad. The way she used to laugh with you. The image hit me like a punch to the gut. Jennifer's laugh, bright, carefree. The one that used to light up a room. Now it belonged to someone else. I closed the photo album, the snap of the cover shutting echoing in the silence. The album felt heavy in my hands, like it was filled with more than just memories. Ethan's fists loosened, and he leaned forward, his voice low. What are you going to do? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked over to the cabinet where I kept my rare books. Among them was a leather-bound copy of The Art of War, a gift from Jennifer years ago, back when we still joked about life being a battlefield. I pulled it out, running my fingers over the embossed title. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'm going to take control, I said finally, my voice firm. Not for revenge. For me. For you. For what's left of this family. Ethan nodded, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. I'm with you, Dad. I opened the book to a page I'd marked years ago, a passage I'd always found oddly comforting. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Jennifer had always been the planner, the strategist. But now it was my turn. I pulled out a folder from the desk drawer. Legal documents, bank statements, everything I'd been quietly gathering since the hotel receipt had tipped me off. The weight of the folder in my hands felt grounding, like I was holding the pieces of a puzzle that finally made sense. Ethan glanced at the folder, his brow furrowing. What's that? Insurance, I said simply. For when the truth comes out. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded again, his fists relaxing completely. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something other than anger or despair. Determination. Resolve. Whatever came next, I wouldn't be blindsided again. The rain outside picked up, hammering against the window like it was trying to get in. But inside, the air felt still, heavy with the weight of decisions yet to be made. I closed the folder and set it back in the drawer, the click of the latch sounding final. Jennifer had made her choices. Now it was time to make mine. The study smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to forgotten things. Jason sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop casting harsh shadows across the room. Spread before him were stacks of bank statements, credit card bills, and receipts. Paper trails that had been meticulously hidden but now lay exposed like open wounds. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages, not from anger, but from the quiet, almost clinical satisfaction of seeing the cracks in Jennifer's carefully constructed facade. It had started with the jewelry box. A week ago, he'd noticed it sitting empty on her dresser, the velvet lining frayed at the edges. She'd always kept her grandmother's pearls in there, a family heirloom she claimed to cherish. When he asked about it, she'd brushed him off with a vague story about needing to have them cleaned. But the lie was too thin, too flimsy to hold up under scrutiny. That had been the first thread, and once he started pulling, the whole tapestry began to unravel. The credit card bills were a revelation. Thousands of dollars spent on designer clothes, luxury spa weekends, and high-end restaurants. Expenses he'd never seen, never signed off on. She'd opened accounts in her name, maxed them out, and then quietly shifted the debt onto their joint accounts, masking it as household expenses. The numbers were staggering, a mountain of debt she'd been hiding for years. And then there were the cash withdrawals. Large sums, always on days when she'd claimed to be at work or visiting her sister. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. Jason leaned back in his chair, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He wasn't angry, not in the way he'd expected to be. Instead, there was a strange calm, a clarity that came with knowing the truth. Jennifer had always been the picture of perfection, her career, her appearance, her social life. She'd built a life that looked flawless from the outside, but inside, it was hollow, propped up by lies and borrowed money. And now that life was crumbling one revelation at a time. He reached for the empty jewelry box, turning it over in his hands. It felt lighter now, not just because it was empty, but because it symbolized everything Jennifer had sacrificed to maintain her image. The pearls were gone, likely pawned or sold to cover some debt she couldn't hide. He wondered if she'd even cared about them, or if they'd just been another prop in her carefully staged life. The next step was clear. He'd use this information not out of spite, but because he had to protect himself. Jennifer had played her hand, and now it was his turn. He opened a new document on his laptop and began to compile the evidence, methodical and precise. Every transaction, every lie, every hidden account, it all went into the file. He wasn't sure yet how he'd use it, but he knew it was leverage, a way to ensure she couldn't take anything more from him. As he worked, the silence of the house pressed in around him. He could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the occasional creak of the floorboards. It was strange, sitting there in the quiet, knowing that his marriage was over, that the woman he'd loved or thought he'd loved was a stranger. But there was no sadness, not anymore, just resolve. By the time he finished, the first light of dawn was creeping through the blinds. He closed the laptop and leaned back, his eyes heavy but his mind clear. The empty jewelry box sat on the desk, a silent reminder of what Jennifer had lost and what he'd gained. Knowledge was power, and for the first time in years, Jason felt like he had the upper hand. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her take anything else from him. Not his dignity, not his pride, and certainly not his future. The dining room felt colder than usual, though the thermostat hadn't budged. Jennifer sat across from me, her fingers drumming lightly on the polished oak table, her usual poise intact. But tonight, there was a flicker in her eyes, a nervous energy she couldn't quite mask. I slid the folder across the table, the sound of paper against would sharp in the silence. She glanced at it, her smirk faltering for just a second before she recovered, her voice dripping with that practiced nonchalance. "What's this, Jason? Another one of your little projects?" she asked, her tone light, but her hands betrayed her. They trembled slightly as she reached for the folder. I didn't answer. I just watched her, the weight of years pressing down on my chest. Her nails, perfectly manicured, clicked against the edge of the folder as she opened it. The first page was a bank statement, one of many I'd spent weeks collecting. Her eyes scanned it quickly, then flicked to the next page and the next. The color drained from her face, her lips parting in a silent gasp. "You wouldn't," she said finally, her voice cracking like thin ice. "You can't just." "I can," I interrupted, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "And I will." She slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Her hands were shaking now, her perfectly composed mask slipping. "This is insane," she spat, but there was no conviction in her words, just desperation. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. It's just money, Jason. We can fix this." "Fix it." I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the table, my gaze locked on hers. "You think this is just about money? This is about trust, Jennifer. About respect. You've been lying to me for years. Every late night at work, every conference you had to attend, it was all a cover for your little escapades. And now you're drowning in debt because of it." Her face twisted, a mix of anger and panic. "You don't understand," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You were never there, Jason. You were always buried in your books, your antiques, your stupid little hobbies. I needed someone who actually saw me, who actually cared." The word stung, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the prenuptial agreement, the one she'd signed all those years ago without a second thought. I laid it on the table next to the folder, the edges crisp and unyielding. "You should have thought about that before you signed this," I said quietly. "Before you decided to gamble away everything we built." She stared at the document, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "You're really going to do this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "After everything?" "After everything," I echoed, my tone final. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Instead, she reached for her wine glass, her hand shaking so badly that the glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the table with a sharp crack, shattering into jagged pieces that scattered across the wood. Red wine spread like a stain, pooling around the broken shards. She stared at it, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, before she pushed back her chair and stood. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "You think you've won, but you haven't. Not yet. I didn't respond. I just watched as she turned on her heel and walked out, her heels clicking against the tile floor. The sound faded, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I sat there for a long time, staring at the mess on the table. The shattered glass, the spilled wine, the folder full of evidence. It felt symbolic, somehow, this chaotic wreckage of what had once been our life together. But for the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was tempered now by something else: resolve. I picked up the prenuptial agreement and slid it back into the folder. The game wasn't over yet, but the balance had shifted. And for the first time, I felt like I was the one holding the cards. The first sign that the dominoes were falling came in the form of a text from Jennifer's best friend, Karen. It was a simple message, forwarded to me by a mutual acquaintance. I can't believe I ever trusted her. The things she's done. I'm done. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as my thumb hovered over the delete button. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, but all I felt was a hollow ache. This wasn't victory. It was just the inevitable unraveling of a life built on lies. The whispers started small, like a faint breeze rustling through the leaves of our social circle. At first, it was just hushed conversations at the country club, the kind that stopped abruptly when I walked into the room. Then came the canceled invitations. Jennifer's name, once a fixture on every guest list, began to disappear. I overheard someone at the gym mention that her book club had quietly removed her from their roster. Too much drama, they said, their tone dripping with faux concern. I almost laughed. Drama? That was the understatement of the century. It wasn't just her social life that was crumbling. Her professional reputation took a nosedive too. I'd always known Jennifer was ambitious, but I never realized how many bridges she'd burned to get where she was. When the rumors about her affair with her boss started circulating, her colleagues didn't rally around her. They turned on her. I got a call from one of her coworkers, a woman I'd met once at a holiday party. She sounded almost apologetic as she told me about the resignation letter Jennifer had submitted. She didn't even fight it, the woman said, her voice tinged with pity. Just packed up her desk and left. I didn't go to the office to see it for myself. I didn't need to. The image of Jennifer walking out of that building, her head held high but her shoulders heavy with shame, played in my mind like a scene from a movie. I wondered if she thought about me in that moment, if she regretted the choices that had led her there. But then I remembered the way she'd looked at me when I confronted her. Cold, defiant, unapologetic. No, Jennifer wasn't the type to dwell on regrets. The final blow came when her so-called friends started distancing themselves. Karen wasn't the only one who cut ties. One by one, they all drifted away, leaving Jennifer isolated in the wreckage of her own making. I saw her once, sitting alone at a cafe, staring into a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of her choices had compressed her into someone I barely recognized. I thought about going over, saying something, anything, but what was there to say? The damage was done. The bridge between us wasn't just burned. It was ash. And yet, even as I watched her world fall apart, I couldn't bring myself to feel the satisfaction I thought I deserved. This wasn't about winning. It was about survival. I'd spent years trying to hold everything together, to be the man she wanted me to be, only to realize that I'd been fighting a losing battle. Jennifer's downfall wasn't my triumph. It was her own. As I sat in my study that night, surrounded by the rare books I'd collected over the years, I felt a strange sense of peace. The crackling fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows on the walls, and for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel oppressive. Felt like closure. I didn't need to gloat or revel in her misery. I just needed to know that I'd done what I had to do, for myself, for my son, and for the life I was determined to rebuild. Jennifer's reputation might be in tatters, but mine was intact. And that, more than anything else, was enough. The crackling fireplace filled the study with a warm, amber glow, casting long shadows across the shelves of leather-bound books. Jason sat in his worn armchair, a glass of bourbon resting on the side table, untouched. The silence was thick but not oppressive. It was the kind of quiet that felt earned, like the calm after a storm. He ran his fingers along the spine of a first-edition Hemingway, the texture familiar and grounding. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something close to peace. The leather chair creaked as he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts drifted to the events of the past few weeks, not with the sharp sting they once carried, but with a dull ache that was easier to carry. Jennifer's social collapse had been swift and brutal, her carefully curated world unraveling like a poorly stitched tapestry. The whispers at her office, the cancelled invitations, the resignation letter she'd handed in without fanfare. It all felt like a distant dream now. He hadn't gloated, hadn't even felt the satisfaction he thought he would. Instead, there was just this quiet stillness and the faint scent of old paper. His son's voice broke the silence. "Dad." Jason turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie. He looked older somehow. The anger that had clouded his face weeks ago replaced by something softer, more tentative. "Hey," Jason said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Come on in." His son hesitated, then stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He sat down, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the shelves of books, the crackling fire, the framed photo of the two of them fishing on the mantel. "You okay?" Jason asked, his voice low. His son shrugged. "Yeah, I guess. Just been thinking." Jason nodded, waiting. He'd learned to let the silence do the work. "I'm sorry," his son said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush, "for not telling you sooner. About her. I didn't know how." Jason exhaled, the weight of the apology settling in his chest. "You don't have to apologize," he said. "I get it. It's not easy, being stuck in the middle." His son looked down at his hands, fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. "I just hate that she did that to you, to us." Jason leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I hate it too," he admitted. "But it's not on you. It's on her. And we're going to be okay. Both of us." His son glanced up, his eyes searching Jason's face. "You really think so?" "I know so," Jason said, his voice firm. "We've got each other. That's all that matters." The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. Jason reached for his bourbon, swirling it in the glass before taking a sip. The warmth spread through him, a small comfort in the quiet of the room. His son stood, shoving his hands back into his pockets. "I'm gonna head to bed," he said. "But thanks, Dad, for not being, weird about it." Jason smiled, a small, tired smile. "Anytime, kid." As the door clicked shut behind him, Jason leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames. The study felt different now, less like a refuge and more like a starting point. The books, the fire, the silence, they were no longer just a retreat from the world. They were part of something new, something he was building piece by piece. He reached for the Hemingway again, flipping it open to a random page. The words blurred as he read, his mind drifting to the future. Not with fear or anger, but with a cautious kind of hope. There were still pieces to pick up, conversations to have, wounds to heal. But for now, in the glow of the fire, surrounded by the things he loved, it was enough. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, breaking the stillness. Jason closed the book, setting it carefully back on the shelf. He stood, stretching, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. Tomorrow would come with all its challenges and uncertainties. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. He turned off the lamp, the room sinking into shadow, and headed for the door. Behind him, the fire burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the dark. The study smelled of old paper and the faint tang of leather, the kind of scent that clings to antique books and quiet evenings. I sat in my favorite chair, the one with the worn armrests that had molded to the shape of my hands over the years. The crackling fireplace cast flickering shadows across the shelves, where my rare books stood like silent sentinels. I held one now, its spine cracked from years of use, the pages whispering softly as I flipped through them. It was a first edition of The Count of Monte Cristo, a story about revenge, justice, and the cost of both. Funny how life mirrors fiction sometimes. I'd spent months unearthing Jennifer's secrets, peeling back the layers of her lies like the pages of this book. Every discovery, the hidden debts, the reckless spending, the affair she tried to bury, had felt like a victory at first. But as I sat there, the weight of it all settled over me like dust on a forgotten shelf. Revenge had been satisfying, sure. Watching her social circle crumble, her perfect facade crack, had given me a bitter kind of pleasure. But now, in the quiet of this room, I wondered if it had been worth it. The closed book in my lap felt heavy, not just in my hands but in my chest. I'd spent so much energy trying to punish her, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. But honor, I realized, wasn't in tearing someone else down. It was in rebuilding yourself, in finding a way to stand tall even when the ground beneath you had been ripped away. I thought about the advice I'd give to someone else in my shoes, some poor soul staring at the wreckage of their life. I'd tell them to breathe, to take it one step at a time, to find something, anything that still felt like theirs. For me, it had been these books, this room, the quiet rhythm of my heartbeat as I turned each page. The new dawn outside the window was faint, the kind of light that creeps in slowly, almost hesitantly. It reminded me of the way I'd started to feel lately, not quite whole, but not shattered anymore either. I'd reconnected with my son, spent hours talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding the bond that Jennifer's betrayal had strained. He'd been angry, hurt, but he'd also been proud of me. "You didn't let her break you," he'd said. And he was right. I hadn't. I closed the book and set it on the table beside me, next to a framed photo of the two of us from happier times. I didn't look at it often, but tonight it felt right. Not as a reminder of what I'd lost, but as a testament to what I'd survived. My heartbeat was steady now, a slow, even rhythm that matched the quiet of the room. I thought about the future, not with fear or bitterness, but with a cautious kind of hope. There would be other chapters, other stories. And this time I'd write them for myself. If I could offer one piece of advice to anyone walking this same painful path, it would be this: honor isn't in revenge. It's in self-respect. It's in finding the strength to close one chapter and begin another, even when the ink is still wet with tears. It's in the quiet moments, the steady heartbeat, the new dawn waiting just outside the window. And it's in knowing that, no matter how deep the betrayal, you're still here, still standing, still turning the page.